It's 11:30. It feels like it's been a long morning already. My name's Kristen Gorguinpour. I'm the Vice President of Programs at the Climate Action Reserve. And I have the privilege of moderating this panel where we're going to talk about SDGs and the impact on credit quality and pricing. Usually my team puts me on panels that are like on Friday afternoon when everybody's like gone home. So I feel like I got a little bit of a upgrade and I get to be with these excellent folks. So I'm gonna kick it off in just a second, but just so you guys know, we want this to be interactive and a discussion. So as we're talking on any points that you have questions about, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. So maybe what we can do to just kick it off is start with introductions. Again, my name is Kristen Gorguinpour. I'm Vice President of Programs at the Climate Action Reserve. My role is just overseeing our various programs that we implement at the Reserve, and I work with the analytical team to do a lot of the day-to-day work of to deliver the Reserve's mission. And so to my left, I have Pedro Barata. He works for EDF and is also part of the ICVCM. Do you want to give a little blurb about yourself?
Yeah, I can do so very quickly. I'm Vice President or Associate Vice President at EDF on carbon pricing and private sector decarbonization. What a mouthful for a title. But essentially, I oversee our efforts on promoting carbon pricing instruments with a special focus on carbon crediting quality. I'm also seconded to the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market, and I'm serving there as a co-chair of the expert panel, working on several of the core criteria for establishing carbon crediting quality. I think that's enough.
Okay, great. And we also have John McDougal, who is with Anew, and I'll give him a chance to introduce himself.
Thank you, Chris. So, good morning, everyone. John McDougal with Anew. Our portfolio, I'm our Vice President of Environmental Products and our portfolio manager, specifically focused on the voluntary market. I've been active in the markets for just about 12 years now, developing, asset managing, and marketing and monetization of offsets from a wide variety of credits in a variety of locations. And Anew was formed last year with the merger of Element Markets and Blue Source. And we now work in over 250 projects. My team itself really focuses in on the overall macro markets and where pricing is, liquidity, and working with a variety of different stakeholders here in North America, but also abroad. Pleasure to be part of the panel. Thanks.
Great, thanks. So we do have a diverse kind of perspective here, kind of from a standard setting side, but also from just like the market side and with like project developers. So, an important aspect of the VCM is the social aspect of offset projects. And, there's this trend where we're moving away from offset projects, not just assessing like no net harm and kind of moving towards like net positive impacts, social impacts. And, beyond the minimum of just like, how many GHG reductions have been made for this particular project, making sure that there's, informed consent and local stakeholder engagement. Buyers and project developers are kind of incorporating co-benefits, and those co-benefits are typically assessed through the UN SDGs through that lens. And so, offset projects are a good place to kind of like incorporate these things, right? Because they're inherently embedded in a lot of offset projects. And so today what we're going to discuss is kind of the why. Why should they be reported? Why does that make a carbon credit higher quality? What's kind of happening in the market now today with the reporting of SDGs. Also, just talking about the challenges associated with reporting those SDGs, right? I think we have some of the quantification with the greenhouse gas reductions and removals, but maybe there's probably more challenges with reporting the SDGs, which might be a little bit more broader, softer, not as tangible in some cases. And then just lastly, we'll probably touch on kind of what buyers and project developers should be kind of like thinking about moving forward as the market's shifting. So again, as we're going through kind of our questions, I'm going to tee up some questions for our panelists. If you have any questions about any points that we're making, please raise your hand and I'll try to call on you. So to kind of tee it up, or just to get started here, maybe we'll start with John to kind of just give us a perspective of what's happening in the market now, of how people are reporting SDGs, why they think it's important, and just what maybe buyers are actually kind of looking for.
Yeah, so maybe a good way to start is, co-benefits or SDGs have always been a part of the voluntary market, as long as I've been active in the markets. And we get asked all the time, what's the right offset to buy, right? It's a voluntary market. It's there's certainly the voluntary market has grown substantially over the last few years. Can you not hear? Sorry. Okay, let me speak a little bit louder. Sorry about that. Okay, so, but essentially, it's always been a part of the market. I would say over the last year and a half, 2 years, and I did hear it a number of times at COP last year in Egypt, where what are we doing in valuing the ecosystem services? Where are we valuing co-benefits? How does that fit into the overall market that we're seeing form in the voluntary market, the Article 6 market? And is there any value in that? And how is that? And I think I want to get to the question, how is that being showcased by buyers? You can go into now a lot of corporate sustainability reports, and they'll speak toward offsets and what they're doing and securing and investing in projects, and how there's biodiversity increases if it's nature-based, if it's adding economics and jobs and things like that toward a project, and how they're trying to showcase that as part of their ESG strategy. So I would say, where we're seeing today is it is a larger part of the discussion. Would I say that it has a huge impact on pricing? Not yet. I would say that not more so than it was a few years ago. I would say that still largely carbon is driving that, but it is certainly something that we get asked more often. And a case in point, I would say, is a group asks, we want to have community impact, or we want to have water retention with our offsets. And so what we would do is match a project within our portfolio, or even go and source it, say in a reputable cook stove project, or community-based, or a borehole project, where they will then go and showcase that in their whatever their audience may be, whether that's on their website, whether it's a sustainability report, or whether that's just in communicating internally. And so I guess that's a real-time, depiction of how we engage in SDGs as it relates to offset purchases.
Great, thank you. That's a good just snapshot of kind of what's happening in the market. Pedro, I'm wondering if you can kind of maybe take a step back and give us like a bigger picture insight into SDGs and kind of why it's critical to carbon credit quality and the perspective of maybe the ICVCM in addressing SDGs within offset projects.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for having me. Before I start, let me just preface with two caveats. One is I'm coming from Lisbon, Portugal, so I'm slightly jet-lagged. If I'm incoherent, I'll notch it down to jet lag. The second caveat, and more to the point, is I have to confess that I'm not a SDG impact expert. For that, any questions you may address to John. But I am a bit of a carbon crediting expert, having been in this market for pretty much 20-something years, since the beginning of the Clean Development Mechanism. And what you see is an evolution at least what I've seen throughout this 20 years, is an evolution where year upon year, the carbon crediting market has suffered from, yesterday at one reception, somebody was telling me a death by 1,000 cuts. Well, not exactly 1,000, but we've been notching up those cuts. Many of those cuts have to do with carbon impact, and so whether it's been issues around additionality or issues around the quantification protocols, those are pretty significant. But the ones that resonate the most, I think, in the public eye are any accusations that somehow what we're doing in this market, and what we're doing when we're creating offsets, is not really creating any sustainable development, local benefits. And that's why over the years, you've seen more and more the quest for some kind of quantification of sustainable development impacts. So to John's kind of final comment, you're not seeing that in carbon prices yet, or you're not seeing it in carbon prices. I would say you're not seeing it in carbon prices yet. I think the hope, in order for us to address collectively what's happening in terms of reputation in this market, the hope is that we can actually use quantification tools, use a number of other instruments to really signal the potential benefits that carbon crediting projects may offer to not just the global climate, but also to local communities in various axes, whether it be water, health, other types of environmental benefits. To what perspective we're having, now taking on my ICDCM hat, we will be coming out next week already with the first batch of criteria related to programs. And we will be asking programs for a quite extensive, to cover a quite extensive set of sustainable development criteria in their program provisions. But most importantly, I think, what we want is to move the current market where essentially the bar is set at signaling that you're not doing any no harm or even no net harm to sustainable development, to move it towards a higher level where you actually establish that you have at least a positive outcome in terms of sustainable development impacts. The question that then comes with that is, well, but then how do you actually quantify that? How do you operationalize this idea that you should be getting the market to a place where not just you're doing something good for the climate, for SDG 13, but you should, on average, do something positive for other SDGs. And that's where even us at the ICDCM, when we're trying to put this standard, this kind of high bar, we lack the expertise and the tools at this stage to actually tell you how this will be done, how this quantification will be done. So the idea is that following the release of these standards, we will be looking to work with carbon crediting standards, with project developers, and really understand what is available in the market in terms of quantification and what we could then, as Integrity Council, endorse to kind of back any claims, any quantification of claims related to sustainable development impacts. So in a nutshell, I think there's been a huge evolution over the last 20 years of thinking around the role of sustainable development impacts in carbon crediting, and we're coming to a place where more and more SDG impacts are going to be center stage in terms of demand, even if it's not yet showing up in substantial volumes. And I think that I'll keep it here. Okay. Otherwise, I'll go on and on.
Great. So, and I think, as you mentioned, there's guidance forthcoming, but it'll probably need to be kind of flushed out a bit. But just generally, I think, carbon project implementation and ongoing MRV it's complex, right? When we're just looking at the quantification methodologies and we're just focused on GHG reductions and removals and making sure that we get that quantification right. So I think in some cases, reporting co-benefits in a credible way might be viewed as kind of burdensome, right? Because it's like we're focused on the reductions, like how do we report these other things? So curious what both of your thoughts are on just the challenges that project developers may face kind of reporting these benefits and potentially how this burden might be alleviated.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, to kind of frame that in my mind is, there's been decades of work that's gone into actual quantifying of carbon, quantifying, the variety of SDGs that's out there. It is a big question mark, and I think there are tools out there that we use for certain projects that, for instance, for nature-based projects or standing forests, where you have other organizations that are maybe already quantifying endangered species or nutrient management or water retention, and so those things that you can pull from that using third-party sources. But in other cases where does not exist, my first thought is, what's the tool to quantify that and verify it? What's the cost associated with that, and does the market reflect a price point that justifies that? And so, let me also say, a verification for a project is rigorous, and I mentioned that. I know a lot of people here know that if we've been participating in the market, but given some of the scrutiny that we've received over the last few months, I think it's important to just highlight that what goes into verifications and validations is no small task. It can take 4, 5, 6, 7 months to go through a site visit and process and do that, and to add an extra element of quantifying SDGs. It would be, I'm interested to see kind of what that pathway would look like, how much additional time, cost would add to that. So I think it would require a careful look at what resources are available to developers to be able to access that information, and if not available, what would be required of them to quantify that. I don't know if that answers the question. It's just that's where my head goes immediately when asked it. So. Yeah.
If I can add, just again, going back to the work of the Integrity Council and how we're seeing sustainable development impacts, because maybe it wasn't clear from my first answer. We have a set of, let's say, baseline, well, not baseline, I can't use baseline in this context, of standard criteria that we will be applying to program provisions on sustainable development. For those criteria, so whether it's safeguards around labor standards or other types of safeguards, obviously there's no, it's a program provision. We're not looking at any particular, put it this way, we're not mandating any quantification by project developers of their impacts. But we are putting forward what we call an attribute, a special tag, for those projects that actually go the extra mile of attempting to quantify their sustainable development impact. It's not about making sure that they reach a particular target or a particular goal in terms of sustainable development, but it's trying to create let's say, a premium class of credit for those who actually do the extra mile. So it goes to John's point about, is there a price point at which these extra efforts would be rewarded? I mean, it's still very, very early days that the release is for next week. But I would imagine that if there is, that would show up in the way these particularly specially tagged projects or specially tagged credits would trade in the market.
Great. Oh, yes.
Yeah, sorry. If you're not mandating quantification, how are you determining that special tag? That's like who goes the extra mile?
Did everyone hear her question? Okay.
We don't have a roving mic. So to be clear, the requirement for any project is that, so programs will have to require of project developers that they, on a qualitative basis, establish that they have a positive SDG impact overall. And that's really for classes of activities that are, that potentially have such impact. So it serves no purpose to ask of an industrial gas project whether they have positive SDG impacts beyond climate, because quite possibly they don't. But at least they're not doing any harm, and they're contributing in terms of the SDG 13. What I'm saying is that for those that we want to tag, we would tag specially those that actually do the extra mile of saying, I'm here a project developer, I've used this particular tool, I'm willing to quantify the impacts of this project on water retention, et cetera, et cetera. What we haven't yet gotten agreement within the Integrity Council, and quite honestly, we want to consult with a wide variety of stakeholders, is what are the appropriate tools for that quantification? But the tag will only state that this project developer has gone the extra mile. So, to take John's point, is this worth something in the market? Well, we'll see. If those credits that have that particular tag in the market are trading at some point with a premium, that's what we are aiming for. But it may, we'll have to see, essentially.
And I would just add, if that's the case, developers are going to be more than happy to spend the time and resources to do it. I think I think the question is, again, I think a lot of it, you use the word qualitative, right? Qualitative is, there's a lot of ways to provide that, and it's readily available. When you get to a point where you're having to quantify inventory, do sampling plots on something beyond the carbon piece, that requires, a expert specialist and things like that. And obviously, that has an operational expense, CapEx expense to it. And so I think that's where, and I'd love to get to that point. I mean, we want to see this market succeed and value all of the environmental attributes, not just carbon. Time will tell.
And I just have a point of clarification for Pedro. So, it sounds like there's this qualitative assessment that can be done, or quantitative, where you get this additional tag. On the qualitative assessment, would that be required to be verified, third-party verified?
So that's a program level requirement that we have. So essentially what we're asking is for programs to require that in their provisions, that project developers, so in their PDD, tell the program how they're meeting this net positive effect, and in a qualitative assessment. How then that gets verified, it really is, we don't go into the detail of that because that is left to the program. So in your case, you would be telling us rather than us telling you. But the point here is that we want to make sure that that gets done. And I think it's, just to go back to what we're trying to do, there's certainly, I think, a bias in a lot of the reporting on offsetting here, or carbon credit, that a lot of the reporting that gets done is a little bit binary, at least in my opinion, in either carbon credits are either evil, the work of demons, or they're sacrosanct and pure. Well, they're neither. They're a human artifact, and so we will be improving over time. We have improved a lot over time. including in the guidance that we're providing. So right now, this is the level of guidance, so we cannot be very specific on things like SDG impacts because we're in a world of ignorance here. There aren't that many quantification tools. There isn't that much experience in quantifying, so we don't want to be prescriptive. As well, we're relying very much on the programs to implement some of the norms that we're doing, and seeing that we'll be watching carefully how they implement. And as they implement, we'll be learning from that implementation and checking up on our own guidance for the next iteration of that guidance.
I'm just going to put John on the spot maybe a little bit. So it sounds like the guidance that's forthcoming is you have to do the qualitative piece. Right now, at least from the reserves side, the only time that we require that SDGs be qualitatively reported is if they are trying to have their credits be CORSIA eligible. So CORSIA eligible credits do need to report SDGs, and the reserve has a reporting tool for that. It's a pretty straightforward tool. It's not verified. We do at the reserve look at it to be like, does this make sense of what the project developer is claiming? So it sounds like for us, like this is something if we moving forward that we would have to require. And I'm just curious, John, would that be a burden? Or I think you mentioned before, like the qualitative piece isn't too difficult, but just curious on your thoughts if it's required.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm familiar with the sheet that Cora has.
Yeah.
Qualitative is a key word. I mean, I think is there a verifier that's going on and confirming, something that exists? That's not a difficult thing to do in tandem with the verification for the carbon. If there is, samples that need to be taken for the amount of biodiversity in a acreage of forest, again, that becomes something that requires specialization, quantification, and resources for it. And it would be, I don't know if I want to use it's not a burden if it's a viable product, right? And we all want to do well by this. Want to move forward with, decarbonization in mind, as long with all the co-benefits that go along with that. But this is a market-based system that we live in. And we don't get billable hours as consultants. We live and our product is the offset. And if we can add value, incremental value on top through a carbon core score that has a viable pathway, and I'm sounding like a broken record at this point, mm-hmm. then we'll do that work. Mm-hmm. In the absence of that, it would be a burden. So. Great.
Well, maybe coming off of that and putting myself in the hot seat a little bit, what role should carbon offset registries play in ensuring that SDGs are incorporated and credibly reported? I mean, they are pretty broad, right? There's 17 of them. Registries are typically experts in quantification, in GHG quantification. So just curious, do your perspective, I think, Pedro, I think I know where you're going, where you may go with this, but just curious, what role should carbon registries be playing to kind of help facilitate this reporting, and do they have the expertise? And also from the verification side, they've been so focused on reductions, removals, how will that maybe shake out?
So let me make just a broader point. We're very lucky in the climate change process, put it this way, in the sense that, and I think John has already alluded to this, that we very early on started quantifying and developing quantification protocols, whether it be at national level through national inventories of GHGs, whether it be through the work of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and several others, like Bilan Carbon for the Francophone countries, etc. And that was, let's say, there's an accretion of work there. And kudos to the unsung heroes of methodology developers across the clean development mechanism, the ACR, CAR, etc., who are constantly putting, let's say, more knowledge into developing these protocols. That's not the case with biodiversity or water. We haven't, for various reasons, we haven't had the level of quantification expertise, if you want, and the man or the person hours put into those exercises. Partly because, quite honestly, it wasn't quite the same strength of issue, and because we didn't develop a market experiment for water benefits or biodiversity benefits. So I hear you, Kristen. It's a little bit unfair, perhaps, to now piggyback on the carbon market infrastructure to start developing quantification and asking from what essentially are carbon registries to redesign an infrastructure to measure SDGs other than SDG 13. Having said that, I think there's quite a lot of potential benefit that comes from that. Not only the potential premium, let's hope, that some of these credits carbon credits will have in the market, but the fact that there are other potentially other environmental markets that will grow in size and will grow in expertise, such as for biodiversity credits or other types of environmental markets. So the sense I have is it's both a burden and an opportunity for carbon registries. From the ICVCM perspective, this is essentially dictated by where the market is going, really. And I think we have to acknowledge that we have to do a lot more in terms of putting a good face on the market, put it this way. And that means also presenting benefits other than just the climate benefit.
Thanks. So I think from Pedro, right, their program, ICVCM, is kind of like looking to the standards to, implement the criteria. John, I'm curious from your perspective what you think project developers or buyers are going to want from registries in this area, whether it's, how our guidance, maybe more transparency surrounding these things. Just curious of your perspective.
Yeah, the registry serves the function as the third party, along with the verifier as the neutral party, right? And so as a buyer, and it's a really important part of the whole process, checks and balances of carbon markets. And to have something that highlights co-benefits next to a project that's, at least assessed and has a third party position or certification, if you will, on it, I think can only do benefit for the carbon markets. So I think that buyers would love to see that. I think buyers want the easiest pathway to figure out how they can check their box for their ESG, and they want to do what's right, and they don't want to be plastered all over the Washington Post for doing it. So the ability to have that third party allowing and having a neutral party nonprofit showcasing that in addition to the carbon value, I think would be hugely beneficial. And I think the question for the registries is, I would think would be the same eventually that we would have is, well, is that going to add value, liquidity, and grow the market such that we can take on that cost and make that process work. So, yeah.
Thanks, John. I know I keep saying this, but when we talk about SDGs, there's 17, there's a lot. They might not apply to every project. Should there be a set criteria of what SDGs are reported, or should it be kind of up to, the project developer thinking about their buyers as they're meeting their, sustainability objectives? Or are there just, are there critical key SDGs that should be reported kind of without a doubt? Like, you always want to see these SDGs because it really speaks to the quality of the credit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that was mentioned I think is important to highlight is that, there's, and we look at this too as well, like what are other forming emerging markets outside of carbon? And you alluded to this, that, is there a separate biodiversity credit, right? And where does the value come in? Where does it, I am a corporate who has an ESG goal that I've stated, right? And where do I get points for this? And, the ICVCM is trying to establish that, right, and allow, the supply side, and then, VCMI is the demand side, trying to establish a scoring method, essentially, for lack of a better word. And does that value, I'm putting my CFO hat of one of these corporates, on pushing my ESG initiative forward? Is the SEC going to tell me that, hey, you said you were going to quantify and have sustainable goals in X, Y, Z and biodiversity? Where is that, right? And being able to have a qualitative, quantitative establishment of whether it comes in a credit form or is tagged with the carbon offset, is that going to have value at the end of the day, and is it measurable for that corporate? And I think that's where we need to start, right, is like, where does that come in and where does that have value? And, traditionally it's been compliance markets. And, are we in a quasi-compliance market for voluntary ESG with everything that's forming right now? And I think that's where my mind goes in this, is that if that starts becoming we need to shore up our quality and our standards, and we need to get confidence back from buyers. But two, within that, and sustainable ESG decarbonization, is there a scoring method? Do I get value for that? And is that conveyed, is that seen by the CFO and the C-suite of these companies going forward? So that's why, I don't know if I went on a tangent there, but.
No.
If I can just add a personal perspective here. I think it would be too easy to say, let's leave it to either project developers or, let's start with project developers. Every single project and a project developer will have an incentive to signal to the market that it is doing a fine job on some criteria. But by the same token, if it's not doing a fine job on some other criteria, it will have a distinct incentive not to signal those impacts. So I think we have to look at, I would almost say, project type, or looking at each mitigation activity and understand what are the likely both negative and positive impacts, so the benefits and impacts that this project activity carries. And hopefully get to a standardized way of reporting on those criteria and those indicators that are relevant. Because putting a good spin or a good positive spin on some, but not all of the impacts is coming back to bite us in the end. So, and that's, I think, something that I think is important, is that for far too often, the carbon market defenders have been very eager to tell the world how great their projects are doing in terms of their impact, in terms of the air quality impacts of cook stove projects, for example, the indoor air quality, but not being forthcoming with, hey, there are some things that we are not really checking and that we should be checking. I'm not going to say what those are, but I think that's just to kind of put a little bit of, not a pinch of salt, but on the wound, but basically to alert to the fact that we need to be a bit broad in our consideration of both benefits and impacts.
Great. I'm going to pose a question I didn't give you guys a heads up on, but something that I've been thinking about now that we're talking about, greenhouse gas project and reductions and SDGs and how they're going to be a critical part of an offset project. and they're going to be reported in project design documents. And sometimes those benefits are immediate and they can be attributed to the project activity. Sometimes those benefits occur over time and maybe outside of the reporting period. What happens if those benefits that are reported are not realized, eventually realized? Does that impact crediting? Is there a risk there that those credits should not be, issued? We have rules in place for dealing with overissuance, but what happens, should we be thinking about the risk of SDGs not being fully implemented within a project?
It's an interesting, it's almost ex ante co-benefits, right? It is, it's true for anything. I mean, that's why we have the validation verification process in place. So it would be important to, I think it kind of comes back to, my head goes is it's ex post versus ex ante, right? Have you realized the co-benefits or the SDGs at point of validation and verification? Can you make a definitive statement in a third party check that's happened? Or are you making statements about your project that in year 10 it will happen? I'm not so sure that I'm not sure you can value that in a form of a credit or as a co-benefit. And at the very least, to your point, Kristen, I think it would be, you need to make sure that the projects are held accountable if they don't realize those outcomes. So,
I agree. I think, first of all, we're still in a carbon crediting system, and so I think it'd be partially unfair if we would come down hard on projects that, for external reasons, for example, would not have been able to meet what they expected would be the sustainable development benefits. Let me say this, if we were talking about crediting of those particular benefits, the biodiversity credits or other types of credits, then obviously that would be a different game. But what I do think is in all of that, we need to have a reporting system that is transparent and honest about why these things did not materialize. Is it, in the end, due to the project design that wasn't the same as was anticipated? Or was it because external factors came in, whatever they may be, so that we can have some learning process here about what works and what doesn't overall in the market. But I wouldn't go as far as say, let's claw back carbon credits on the back of they didn't meet their air quality benefits that they claim. I think that would be a bit too much.
No, that makes sense. And I think just something from a program perspective, we need to think about, as we ask people to report things like, what does that mean? Because we ask them to report emission reductions, right? And as I mentioned before, we have rules in place for dealing with errors in reporting. So I think that's something we'll have to think about, but also maybe there should be a focus on kind of those immediate benefits that can be verified as opposed to those longer term benefits. Yeah. Hi.
But yes, I think what's so fascinating about our sector is that it's so multidisciplinary, and there are a lot of silos that we need to break down, and I do think that there's expertise and the frameworks and the tools to exist. And I know the imagination is a very good example of those silos. They have the human development index, they have the human development reporting route, you know, they have all sorts of stuff. So I think that with the right expertise, this can be certainly approached at the project level with developers need to be integrating the indicator selection at the very front end of a project, so that when we design a project, and communities in this case, let's say, select which SDGs they would like to achieve, through their participation, that's what determines what will be achieved, and that's also what motivates stakeholders to continue to implement the project, because sometimes the monetary or the carbon part is not really the most appealing part of why they're doing the project, you know. So I think participation is a really big thing for anyone who's working on the ground with communities, because you need to have their buy-in, and ideally they should be setting their own targets, and then with appropriate expertise, we can really create monitoring frameworks that are realistic and then get reevaluated continually as progress or learning occurs and adjusted accordingly. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we can do this. And I do, as a programmer standard, think about, as we see this coming, you know, what resources can we leverage and what a lot of this work has been done, right? And so how do we kind of use those best practices to incorporate them into our guidance that we can deliver to our project developers. Curious if there's any other questions, if there were things that we didn't hit on that you're curious about.
Hi, Olivier from Quantum Commodity Intelligence. I just have a question to Pedro. Just wonder whether you feel the CCPs are enough to reassure buyers of connaissance. Is there a need for regulatory intervention instead, like the CFTC or ISO?
Okay, I wasn't expecting that at this session. The CCPs are addressing one issue. There are many, many issues in the carbon market affecting both demand and supply and just the general context. So to your point, is it enough to, I think you said something like restoring buyer confidence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The prices are down.
Right. Is it enough? Probably not, to be honest. But I hope, and I really meaning here, I hope it is a contribution. But there's a lot other things happening here. So, for example, some buyers are confused around the role of corresponding adjustments and host country authorizations. Should they, if they're investing in developing countries, should they be seeking a host country authorization from a local government or not? And there's, how could I say this? There's a broad spectrum of views on that issue. So as long as that, for instance, is an issue where the appropriate bodies, so to speak, have not put out a response, a coordinated response, then I would say that buyers will still have that lingering doubt, you know, am I doing the right thing by either buying with a corresponding adjustment or buying without a corresponding adjustment? In the framework of ICVCM, for example, we do not ask that a corresponding adjustment be sought, put it this way. All we do is, and that's basically an enabling function, we have an attribute, so a similar tag to the one that we've been discussing around SDG impacts, where if a project developer so wants, or potential seller of a credit so wants, it can signal to the market that a particular credit has gotten a host country authorization. And again, the hope is that if there's a market, a specific market for those buyers that for whatever reason, need that host country authorization, that's what that signal, that tag is looking for. But we are not going to clarify to the market whether or not it is a good thing to buy correspondingly adjusted or non-correspondingly adjusted credits. There are a number of other issues around corporate demand, for example, that need to be clarified in the market. So, to take another example, should reduction credits still be used towards meeting interim targets under a framework such as SBTI? That needs to be, firmly responded to either in the affirmative or in the negative, so that buyers understand what they can go after, put it this way. So, in a nutshell, we hope it is a good contribution to restoring some confidence in the market, but I don't think that the work of the ICVCM by itself resolves all of the questions that are kind of preventing that demand. I'd like to take views on those opinions, by the way.
Yeah, John, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yeah, it's a whole other session. If we're talking about buyer sentiment right now, I mean, there's a few things that are happening in my view. There's a lot of, I think first and foremost, some corporates are just slow to move. They have 2030 targets, they have 2050 targets. The bureaucracy of moving and getting in place and actually transacting in the market is taking longer than others had hoped. 2030 is right around the corner. And there's some very lofty statements that have been made and goals that have been set that they're going to be, some would say they're going to be held to. And the expectation is they're not going to be able to get that there through internal reductions alone. So I think that's going to be part of that's going to drive the pick back up in the market. Others, I do think ICVCM, VCMI, and others just providing that extra layer of review on these markets will instill some confidence. And I think, and I'll put it to Kristen, I think the registries too, need to continue to defend their programs that have been around for decades, right? And there's, I think, a lot of information that's being put out there that is narrative driven and it doesn't get the full story, and I think buyers just need to be educated on that. The last thing I'll say is, in our business, I spend 80% of our time educating clients, 20% of our time transacting. These are long sales cycles, and the more turn we get and the more entrants that we get that get familiar with this and it becomes part of their regular repertoire and transactions, I think you're going to start seeing liquidity pick up. So.
You get a 2-for-1 in this session. Any other questions? I'll go here.
There's 3 there.
Okay, yeah.
Well, if I understood correctly, you're looking at have we looked at the implications of having this broad view of SDGs on project development costs, basically, in terms of staffing? Was that the
Well, staffing, competency. I mean, what would you expect? The forester may not be able to assess the probability of health outcome on a forestry project. So how would you overcome that issue to make sure that the assessment of SDGs is actually right and can be verified?
Very good question. Let me go back a few years ago when I was on the CDM executive board. Well, that was many years ago, thankfully. And we found out something really strange in the UN system, which was we were sending out validators to, well, not we, but the system, the DOEs, as they were called, to projects with the wrong technical competence. So literally what you just mentioned, you could have an industrial gas project in Korea that was being validated by a forester from India. And what we did in the executive board, and it took us a while to actually convince everybody, including the DOEs at the time, that this was the right thing, was we had technical competence requirements. So basically, now if you're in the forestry project, you need to have a forester do the work. I understand what you mean in saying, like, if we then go down from the validator to the project developer, that will likely mean, you know, carrying a lot of extra costs. I think that's why we need to be a little bit careful about what we are asking project developers. But that doesn't mean that we should stop seeking this. I think there are ways of that expertise being taken on board by project developers, either through subcontracting, either through, you know, specialization, perhaps even at some point, you know, creating, let me put it this way, an industry of people that are competent, that are checked for their competence for those types of assessments. But I think we are very much at the early stages of this. The same way that when we started carbon offset and carbon crediting, nobody knew how we do validation for carbon crediting projects. Back in 1997 or 98, when we started thinking about these concepts, right? So it'll take some time. We shouldn't, we don't have a lot of time, but we shouldn't also rush into these things.
I would just add real quickly on that. I know we're running out of time. Look, the way we think about it from a developer standpoint is the same as way as I assume you are, is what's the marginal cost to develop that credit, right? And does the market justify that cost? And if we find ourselves in a situation where you're finding demand, or maybe even the carbon, you know, CCPs become universally used by buyers, right? Well, then that's going to set a floor price for marginal cost, which is then going to have to dictate a price point to have any kind of credits generated. So, you know, we'll see if that happens. That's just, again, I'm just thinking kind of commercially about it, financially about it, right? If that's the case, price has to go up, right? And so, and you know, candidly, price needs to go up to create more reductions and to have continual change in this system. So, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
I'm curious, with an increased emphasis on SDGs, for the SDGs that have social indicators, how do we ensure that benefits last beyond the project duration and don't result in negative externalities for communities after the project ends or in the event that the project ends prematurely?
So what I can use as an example, there are measures that are put in place for, you know, for instance, nature-based projects that go beyond, right? And there are, I would say the quantification of that credit is set on that crediting period as well. So it doesn't go beyond, say, certain thresholds or crediting periods. So if something were to happen, then that should have already been essentially quantified within that protocol. If you're looking for permanent and perpetuity for certain things, right? You know, it's a great question. You know, the first thing that comes to mind that I can think is comparable to it is a conservation easement that's in perpetuity, right? That requires things that are legally bound and have teeth to it. But that's for nature-based, right? That's not for every type of project. So I guess the better way to answer that question is, if you're making a claim toward SDGs, a temporal span probably needs to be understood, right? This is where we're measuring, this is what we're validating, this is what we're verifying up into this point. And, you know, you could make suggestions or say that this is going to happen continually, but I don't know if that can be substantiated or validated or verified. I think it needs to be clear on the verification and validation of that SDG.
I don't have much to add. I think the only thing that I would add is you mentioned the involvement of local stakeholders. I think in defining what those impacts are, right?
I guess my point is that, if a project developer comes in and says they're going to create an ecotourism component of the project that's going to provide extra benefits, and then the project fails, what happens if the community is kind of left in the lurch and has been promised all of these things, and then
So,
what happens next?
okay, that's a more serious issue, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's more serious because it goes, again, to the credibility of what we're doing. One of the things that I've been most fascinated since I've been on this ICVCM role is the fact that there's a lot of claims of potential benefit sharing with local communities, but we actually do not have such a strong system of putting the onus on the project developer to really tell us what those benefits are that are being shared, and how are they shared, and how are they materializing. The ICVCM, for example, we have sought to really get guidance going on this benefit sharing. It probably won't, the kind of guidance that I personally would have wanted the ICVCM to put out won't be coming in this first iteration. But I think there are a number of people within the ICVCM and outside of the ICVCM that are keenly aware that we need to make sure that when a project developer makes a claim about a shared benefit, that is actually coming through. And again, as with other comments that I made, even if we don't claw back the carbon credits, we certainly should be understanding why those benefits haven't materialized. One of the most jarring moments to me was in Sharm el-Sheikh having a consultation with representatives of indigenous peoples and having them tell me how they're being harassed, to be honest, by project developers, carbon credit intermediaries, snake oil salesmen, coming to them and promising all kinds of stuff, and then the experience of not seeing any of that realized. So that's what we need to get to grips on.
Do you want to take one more question or over?
I can take one more if there's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, just that point a little bit, I'd say that perhaps a way forward would be that the moment you prioritize that temporally, or the initial work that you have to do for an ADS project has to do with capacity building that is long lasting, and you do the right partnerships with NGOs on the ground, for example, that have been doing this kind of work for a long time, right? And if your agreement, has forces these developers to actually be matched to an NGO that has that capacity coordination for producing on the corner, that could be a good safeguard to do that, right? To not abandon the project. Because then these are people that have been working there for decades, and for example, about forestry or about tourism, they might, if you prioritize that at the beginning, if it's about building capital, then you might still reap the benefits even if everything else fails. So the carbon is more of a benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the great point. I think there's, NGOs have been doing this well beyond when carbon markets have been existing. So like that's using the boots on the ground and having those relationships is especially important in developing countries. One thing that I will say is that, and there are, developers aren't free of fault, right? They're not perfect, and there are some snake oil salesmen out there. But I would say that's a very small subset of who I've met over the years. Mm-hmm. What I would say that the largest thing that's happened over the last decade that hasn't, why communities haven't seen, the value of what they've been promised or what they're hoping for, is the market wasn't there. The market, if you had a market that really just went dormant for 5-7 years and it was just illiquid. And it wasn't until the advent of ESG a few years ago that started pressing that market price forward. And I would be very confident in saying, I bet a lot of those projects and communities started seeing more benefits as that price started moving and liquidity in the market drove upwards. So, and I say that because to talk about buyers' confidence, like, let's look at the whole market as a whole and what the value it does by participating in this market, not just in the project that you're investing in, but in the whole, flywheel of, if you're putting demand into the market, you're increasing price, you're putting a price signal up there, it's creating more reductions and more value and co-benefits for everyone. And so I just think that this market has a lot of potential that hasn't been realized yet, and we need to start with, with buyer confidence and a higher price on carbon, in my opinion.
Well, I know it's lunchtime. Thank you for hanging in there. Please take a moment to thank my distinguished panel. I appreciate it.